Welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to explore the second New Deal and the way that the Roosevelt administration, once it was clear that their first New Deal wasn't doing the job, changed course in the run up to the election of 1936. So let's dive in. Hopefully, by the end of this, you'll be able to differentiate between the second and the first New Deal and explain how its scope was somewhat different. You'll evaluate the opposition to Roosevelt's agenda, and then we'll look at the extent to which Roosevelt's second New Deal was effective. So let's jump into our story here. One of the first New Deal, of course, was ineffective for a variety of reasons. Some of it was the scope, some of it was the contradictory policies, and quite frankly, some of it is the fact that a lot of the key reforms were utterly unconstitutional. And so both the NRA and the AIA were kicked out by the Supreme Court, who argued that the federal government does not have the scope to do this according to the Constitution. And so FDR first tried to pack the court by pushing a mandatory retirement age for Supreme Court justices, which was a bridge too far for Congress, and they refused to do it. He then tried to add 5 new Supreme Court justices to the Supreme Court, which again was a bridge too far, and Congress refused to go along, and so Roosevelt's court packing schemes failed, and the Supreme Court continued to be an obstacle to the Roosevelt administration. As far as the second New Deal goes, it was way, way larger than the first, and more of the things that were passed as a part of it are still part of the United States today. So, for example, look at all these different things. Crop insurance, for example. The National Labor Relations Act, still around. The Rural Electrification Administration, still around. Social Security, still around. And the WPA was a massive works program, which basically hired people to do whatever they were trained to do previously. All of their work would then be in the public domain, and the government would own it. And so we get massive amounts of literature, of art, of music, things like that, composed as part of the WPA that both put people back to work and continued people sort of exploring the cultural pursuits. So that's part of the legacy of the Second New Deal. The most long-lasting and important part of the Second New Deal was Social Security. Social Security provides an old age pension and disability benefits for Americans, and it's paid for through a payroll tax. So it's money that's taken out of your paycheck that will be held by the government, and then they will theoretically redistribute that to you when you get old. So basically, partially like forcing you to save for retirement. And so Social Security, of course, a massive entitlement program that is very, very important to the United States at this point. The Rural Electrification Agency built infrastructure for electricity, hydroelectric dams to generate it, and brought power to significant areas of the country that had never really been connected to the power grid before. And so the REA is significant because we think of a lot of the changes of the Gilded Age being sort of universally applied to Americans. Oh, now Americans have electricity. Now they have the telephone. Now they have access to radio. Now they have access to all of these different things. But for rural people, the amount of infrastructure required to build and connect them to the grid is disproportionate to the number of people that would actually be affected by it. And so it wasn't profitable for most power companies to connect rural areas to the system. So the REA does that. And the federal government then becomes the one who's responsible for bringing these communities into the quote unquote modern era, whatever that means. So REA. Plus, of course, it also puts people to work as a work program. And this electricity creates new opportunities for economic development within these communities. So hitting multiple check boxes as far as what it's attempting to accomplish. The Wagner Act now formally legalized unions and stopped the practice of the Sherman Antitrust Act being used to break them up. So it's going to some degree, empower labor with, some effectiveness, although this is going to be something that we're going to be fighting about for the next, honestly, until today, when we're still fighting about it. And so for the election of 1936, unemployment was still relatively high. But again, we get Roosevelt's New Deal, his second he lays out this agenda for why he deserves a second term, despite the fact that, unemployment has not really been eliminated, and we're still in the midst of the Great Depression. But Roosevelt's able to win re-election relatively easily. You don't even need to know who Alf Landon of Kansas is. because Roosevelt, stomps the floor with him in one of the most one-sided elections in American history. I mean, you'd have to go back to 1820 or to 1788 to see a more one-sided election. Roosevelt was so effective because of he put together what's called the New Deal Coalition, which becomes the heart of the Democratic Party for pretty much the rest of the 20th century. So the New Deal Coalition is white Southerners who are never going to vote for one of those Republicans, because you remember what that Abraham Lincoln did, African Americans who generally support Roosevelt's policies because they were able to benefit. I mean, admittedly, a lot of the New Deal programs were racistly applied, but African Americans did get some measure of relief from these New Deal programs. And so they are going to switch from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. And of course, the irony of white Southerners and Black people being in the same political coalition is not lost on anyone, hopefully. Laborers and labor unions become part of this New Deal coalition, and farmers who are benefiting from rural electrification, as well as Roosevelt's attempts to stop mortgage foreclosures and things like that. And so these different groups become the heart of the Democratic Party. And over time, of course, they're going to get chipped away at. I should also mention urban intellectuals tend to also be part of this. Your former progressives who didn't have any home after 1920 joined this New Deal coalition, basically arguing that this is progressivism. We're using scientific solutions to try to solve society's problems and eliminate the worst abuses of society. So this coalition becomes pretty enduring, and in the end is going to more or less is going to exist up until the 1960s start really chipping away parts of this. So there are absolutely some successes to the New Deal. Roosevelt specifically, the FDIC is a massive success. It's going to stop these future runs on banks, and it's going to hopefully restore Americans' faith in their banking system. For Native Americans, it was somewhat of a success in that they get some measure of tribal autonomy back, which better than the terrible land that they were given in the aftermath of the Dawes Act. It establishes a federal minimum wage, which in the end is theoretically going to help workers. It puts a lot of people back to work and gives them hope. And FDR's use of the radio to communicate all these things and to build popular support was incredibly successful. Roosevelt gave a series of sort of regular updates that were known as fireside chats, where he directly addressed the nation using radio. So the same way that Teddy Roosevelt used the newspapers to directly communicate with the American public, FDR is going to use the radio. And it's, again, incredibly effective and transformative in that Americans are now going to start expecting their presidents to directly talk to them and make them feel as if they are part of this struggle. So all of those, very successful. As far as failures go, the federal government is going to run some significant deficits despite Roosevelt's attempts otherwise. And so what we're going to see is the beginning of a relatively persistent national debt, especially after World War II, is going to significantly increase our expenditures, as you see here by this chart. Unemployment is really not going to decrease until after World War II starts. And so it's very tough to argue that the New Deal ended the Great Depression, because even as of 1940, it was still pretty much Great Depressioning on. Some people would argue that all of these entitlement programs create a dependence on the federal government, destroy initiative, and destroy incentives for people to work. And so bringing in an element of socialism. And of course, once you start entitlement programs, it becomes absolutely impossible to get rid of them. And so many of the entitlement programs of the New Deals to start us on this path to where we are now, where we've got a huge portion of our budget in what's called non-discretionary spending, that are entitlement programs that if you try to get rid of them, you will be voted out of office, which makes it really, really difficult to balance the budget. And of course, because so much of the money was given to specifically to states, oftentimes it was given out in a relatively racist way. And so, for example, Southern sharecroppers benefited really not at all from the New Deal, the same way that sort of urban Northern African Americans did. So the legacy of FDR is complicated. On the one hand, he has become kind of the modern poster child for democratic liberalism. I mean, he is the president to which most Democratic presidents are measured against. The whole 100 days thing is probably an unfair way to judge presidents, but all presidents will now be judged based on that metric because of what FDR accomplished in his first 100 days, which is obviously far more than pretty much anyone could ever hope for. But at the same time, we start seeing federal programs whittling away at the Constitution. We start passing laws that are questionably constitutional and then basically demanding that the Supreme Court be the referee. We see a massive expansion of government, and it really starts to shift the power of federal government from Congress to the presidency, as FDR is more than any other president so far has set the legislative agenda. So what do we do with all that? Not sure. In the end, it really depends on your own sort of political leanings, whether you feel FDR is a hero or a villain. And I think in general, he's now looked at pretty favorably by most Americans. For a long time, he was a much more controversial figure. So, in the end, as I said, the way you feel about FDR says more about you, I think, than it does about him. So with that, we come back to our objectives. So hopefully you can answer these in some detail. And when we come back, foreign affairs have somewhat gotten out of hand at this point. And in Roosevelt's second term, we're going to see wars break out in Asia and also in Europe. So, man, we're going to have to deal with that.